So we are on part 4 of our unit, and this is the sort of wrap up. So just a quick recap. So part 1, we looked at um, political and economic ideas. Part 2, we looked at the growth of labor in the United States. Part 3, we looked at um, business and how it reacted to labor. Or actually, it's the other way around. Sorry. So part 1 was um, economics and politics. Part 2 was business and the growth of the American economy and the entrepreneur class, if you will. Then part 3 was labor and how labor and business reacted and interacted with each other. And we kind of wrapped it up by looking at um, the gospel of wealth and the idea that it's the responsibility of the individual, not the government, to care for society. Part 4, it's titled Back to the Beginning, or Return of the Bearded Weirdos. Part 4, we're going to go back and look at government in the time of this change in America. And we are looking at 3 presidents here. Rutherford Bertrand Hayes, Grover Cleveland, no, sorry, James Garfield, and this is Benjamin Harrison, um, who's there's a guy in between here. Actually, yeah, I don't know why I got Harrison here, but I do. So, but yeah, he's here. Okay, so let's go visit here and talk a little bit about these guys. So let's start with Rutherford Bertrand Hayes. Now, if you remember, let's go back a little bit here and revisit. Hayes won the election of 1876 by a sort of backstage compromise between the Democrats and Republicans. It was a secret agreement that the Democrats agreed to let Hayes be president. In exchange, they got a bunch of concessions from the Republicans. And the Republicans, for their part, they got to retain control of the executive branch as other parts of the government were kind of slipping away from them. Now, Hayes only serves one term. This was partly his choice and partly the Republican Party's choice. When you're a one-term president, it's really hard to do anything. And I pointed this out in class before, but he probably actually could have been a good president if he had had more of an opportunity. The biggest success of Hayes's administration is the ending of the corruption that riddled Grant's administration. He is really not able to do much of anything else. He tries fixing some other things, but his big achievement is ending the corruption. And at least with the executive branch, he institutes a policy that's known as meritocracy. Now remember, anything ocracy is a form of government. Merit is deserve, like how much you deserve something, or that you have earned something, maybe a better way to put it. Like merit award winners at the assembly. A meritocracy is a government where everybody who has a job earned the job. Prior to Hayes's administration, it was common policy that executive branch jobs, and in fact most government jobs, went to people who were being rewarded. It was a great form of cronyism. And remember, like crony capitalism, where the government's your sketchy friend? Well, in this case, cronyism is the idea that you get rewarded because you supported somebody and you're the sketchy friend. So to sort of very briefly put this in an easy manageable form, Hayes began the practice of, if you wanted a job in the executive branch, you had to prove you could actually do the job. So, for example, if you wanted to be like an advisor in the Treasury Department, you kind of had to know like how money worked and how the like markets worked and everything else. It wasn't just enough that you had secured like 23,000 votes for the candidate who won. You actually had to prove you were worth this. Now, Hayes tried to do the same thing across government as a whole. He wanted to make it so that um, if you wanted a job in the legislative branch or you wanted a job with the judicial branch, you had to be qualified. The Congress would not go along with that. But through executive order, he did mandate and force the executive branch to go through with this idea of you had to be qualified to have a job. Now, as an interesting aside on a personal note, Hayes is what we would refer to as a teetotaler. That is a person who does not drink alcohol. Now, this is an important thing to understand because this may seem like what's the big deal about this? Hayes is not a teetotaler necessarily by choice. Obviously, it's his choice not to drink, but he had no problem with people who wanted to drink. His wife, however, did. Lucy Hayes was a member of a very, very prominent and growing movement of women in the country known as the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. Temperance is the belief that you have to restrict, and this is an old word for the use, temper. Um, you have to control alcohol consumption. And there was a growing belief among many women, particularly evangelical Protestant Christian women, that alcohol was the tool of the devil. And it had to be not only restricted, it had to be eliminated. And so Hayes just went along with this to make his wife happy. And, you know, really, he promoted the idea that we're not going to have alcohol at most government functions. As we shall see later, this proves to be a very big issue indeed, resulting in the Constitution actually briefly being changed to accommodate it. If there's one area that Hayes absolutely fails in completely, it is in the issue of civil rights. And Hayes, remember, he actually was a champion of civil rights. He was the guy who got the 15th Amendment ratified by his home state of Ohio. The problem is that Hayes also wanted to go back to the constitutional idea that the states are where the real power is, and that unless you're doing something major, it's not the federal government's job to interfere with the states. As a result, when Reconstruction ended, the southern states went back to running themselves, and they just abused African Americans. And Hayes would not step in to do anything about this. Now, the reason behind this is not only his belief about the constitutionality of what the states were allowed to do, he was desperately trying to win Republican support in the South. This failed miserably. The Klan would not let you vote Republican if it was at all possible. So, succeeded in fixing corruption, absolutely failed when it came to civil rights. Now, as far as business and money go, we had talked about this before. Hayes was a big believer in the gold standard. Um, and he severely restricted the amount of silver that the government would actively use or buy. There is one very big issue that Hayes was involved with in terms of gold, and that was the issue of the greenbacks. Because remember, in the election of 1876, there was actually the Greenback Party who were all about this idea of backing up the currency with silver in order to legitimize the fake paper money that had been issued during the Civil War by Lincoln. Hayes wanted to get rid of all of it, and he came up with a very controversial idea of how to do this. It is referred to as the buyback compromise. The best way I can explain it would be like this. Imagine if for a short period of time the government said that if you come into any bank with play money, like monopoly money or money, fake money, we will give you real money in exchange for it. That's what Hayes did. If you came into a bank, the government would exchange greenbacks for real money. Now, this drove the debt up, but what it did was it got the greenbacks out of circulation. And he specifically said that after a certain point, greenbacks will no longer be accepted by anybody. They would be completely removed. And so most people took advantage of this. It really does water down the currency, but he had to do something to get rid of the greenbacks. And this was the way he did it. Now, as we've already talked about too, Hayes was very pro business. He favored business. He used the military to put down the B&O railroad strike. That is the first time that federal troops were sent in to stop a labor issue, where basically they invoked an obscure law from 1807 called the Insurrection Act, and Hayes was the first president to use that to break up labor problems. The ironic part about this is that he was actually very sympathetic with labor. There were problems that were like issues that were just not being addressed, and Hayes felt that companies were partly to blame for this. The number of immigrants that came to America after the Civil War, normal immigrants, we're not talking about the wacky ones that came prior to the war who were anarchists. The number of regular immigrants coming in was a big source of tension with labor because they were now workers competing for jobs. Companies used this big influx of immigrants to cut wages, increase hours, basically abuse their ability because there's a surplus of labor with a shortage of supply. There's a huge demand. There wasn't a huge demand. There was a small, there was a huge demand for labor as far as like laborers wanting jobs, but the jobs were very scarce. And as a result, companies played this game where they cut wages and stuff. And much of the problems, especially around the railroad strike, had to do with what we talked about before, the overexpansion of the railroad after the Civil War, the horrible decision by banks to overinvest in railroad development, the failure of banks, and the pressure that it put on everyday people. The problem that Hayes really had with labor was the unions themselves, because he was of the opinion that most of them were probably run by socialists or anarchists, and this was very anti-American. Now, next up, we have the election of 1880. In 1880, the Republicans, who, remember, were not going to run Hayes again, nominated James Garfield for president. Running against him was former Civil War general, hero of Gettysburg, and I mean legitimate hero of Gettysburg, in terms of he is the guy who basically won the Battle of Gettysburg for the Union Army. Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock had been a Republican. He was so disillusioned by the handling of Reconstruction that he became a Democrat. Ironically enough, he absolutely loathed the Ku Klux Klan, but they still voted for him. They were very similar candidates. Garfield had been a Union general as well. Garfield wins the election by less than 2,000 total votes. So if you want to put that in perspective, he wins it by basically about 60 votes per state. That ain't a lot of people. Garfield, if you'll notice here, I put this down here. He's president for only a few months. He's inaugurated in March. He's killed in September. During his brief time in office, though, he really does begin to sort of show what kind of president he would have been. He reasserts presidential power. Unlike Hayes, who won sketchily, shall we say, Garfield won legitimately with no secret agreements. And he begins reasserting the fact that, no, I'm the president. I am the guy who is going to make decisions, and the Congress is going to go along with me. Probably the main thing that Garfield does that is worth noting, that he actually is able to do, is he begins the process of updating the Navy. We're only a couple of years removed here from the World's Fair, and the growing fear of Germany and the potential of attack on the United States by a foreign country really pushes us to update the Navy, which is seen as our defense against foreign invasion, which should tell you that we're not really afraid of an invasion from Mexico or from Canada. Garfield is the first of 5 administrations that will attempt to oversee this, and millions of dollars spent with some not necessarily stellar results. He did try to institute merit across the government. He proposed a law, or he supported a law called the Pendleton Act, which would have made it a requirement for all government jobs to be merit-based, and you had to take a test. The Congress would not go along with this, and herein lies the great irony. Garfield was killed by a man named Charles Guiteau, who literally walked up to him one day at a railroad station and said, "My name is Charles Guiteau. I wanted to be ambassador to France. You wouldn't appoint me. Die." And he shoots him. And they grab Guiteau and they arrest him. He's eventually killed for shooting the president. Garfield actually was not dead. They took him to the doctor. What does kill Garfield is the doctors at the hospital didn't bother to sterilize their hands or their instruments. They went in to remove the bullet. They got him an internal infection, which resulted in a septic condition, and he died from internal necrosis, which is where literally your tissues begin rotting from the inside out. He is considered to be the victim of assassination, but Garfield's death marks a distinct change here. He is the second president to be assassinated. Oh, by the way, interesting little tidbit for you. There was no Secret Service at the time. The president did have bodyguards that were appointed by the military. One of his bodyguards was the son of Abraham Lincoln. How's that for a weird symmetry? But as we will see, Garfield's death, it not only shocks the nation, it does stir change. And just before we go, here's James Garfield and a look of Garfield throughout the years. So let's load this up here real quick. Garfield in 1878. 100 years later, he kind of put on some weight and really jowly. Then more kind of normal looking, kind of okay-ish. And then, kind of went through an emo phase. More or less fat and happy, and now is the fat, happy tabby we all know. Garfield, the president, actually gave his name to Garfield the cat. So that's where that comes from. Peace and love.